This view, looking right in this area, is really, really important, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. In Acts chapter 13, and I'm going to go to 3 different passages because this is really, it behooves us to actually read the passage when it comes to Antioch. And Antioch is mentioned several times in the Bible, as you know. But in Acts 13:1, it says, the church at Antioch. Okay, was it this specific place? It could be. We didn't come here to visit structures. We came here to get in touch with where things happen, how they happened, what happened indeed. And if this was the actual location of where Christians met in those days, then this would be considered perhaps the first Christian church. And the reason I say that is not because churches didn't meet prior to this, but this is where they were first called Christians. So if this was the actual location, you are truly at the first Christian church. Of course, that term came about as a derogatory term, as you know, because the Jews who were not Messianic didn't like the Jews who were Messianic because they were letting the Gentiles in, and they finally wanted to draw a distinction between the Jewish sects and the what we would call Christian or the Messianic sects. So they began to call them little Christs, or associated with the Messianics, the Christians, and it was not at the time a kind term. Now it is, and here we are. And this may very well be the exact location. But at the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers, and Barnabas, Simeon, and called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul, our very own Apostle Paul. And while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. First thing about this place, this is where the first missionary journey began. Here, somewhere in the vicinity of this area here, maybe not here, but somewhere around here, there is this meeting going on, a prayer meeting with prophets there, and of course Barnabas and Saul are set apart by the Lord. Send them out, and this is where it's from. The reason I say it could be here or it could be someplace else is this area that you can see right here, the hillside on down to, you can almost see where it ends. It's like there's a more modern area and then there's something a little bit tighter in here, and it goes off in that direction. This area here was all Jews. This was the Jewish quarter. It was huge. Antioch was the 3rd largest city in the Roman world. There was a road that ran through this section at the edge of it that ran all the way down to what was called the Daphne Gate, and then down to the city of Daphne. You saw in that movie this woman turning into a tree, Daphne, okay? It was named after her, a mythological character down in that direction. But this whole segment right in here, covering thousands and thousands of homes originally, it was all Jewish. Now, you may or may not have known this, but in those days, Asia Minor, if you were to do a census, in general, all of Asia Minor at the time of Jesus was about 10% Jewish. Now, we're going to talk about this more a little bit tomorrow when we're in Tarsus, because there's some things that we need to kind of pull together, having been here several days, and we've left a lot of loose ends, and we need to pull a lot of them together. Asia Minor, 10% Jewish, mainly because, well, first of all, Babylon comes in, the Jews evacuate because they know that they're going to be exiled. The ones that aren't exiled, the ones that escaped, a lot of them ended up here. But even during the time of Alexander the Great, you had Jews in the land that cooperated so well with the Ptolemies, who came right after Alexander. They were considered great fighters, very loyal and patriotic protectors of the Greeks. Now, this is important to remember, of the Greeks, and we'll get to that tomorrow too. Again, sort of baiting you a little bit, but we need to deal with this. So as they're in this area, they're protecting the Ptolemies. They do such a good job as fighters in this area that the Ptolemies give them a pass on all the taxes and double their salaries, as it were. They reward them handsomely. So the Jews are very, very popular in this land. But there's another reason they're even more popular in this land, which is going to come into play a little bit when I talk tomorrow and when we get to the church at Philadelphia. There's an awful lot to say there. So it's going to be an ongoing story. So if you'll forgive me for not giving you the punchline, I don't want to keep you here all night because of that. So we're going to break it down into parts. But they were very, very popular here, the Jewish people. They had this huge quarter. Somewhere between here and right in that area is where Paul and Barnabas are now picked to be sent off. So you're looking at the area where it happened. This is the first missionary journey. But something else happens here. Now, it happens to be written to a group of people who didn't live here. They lived more in central Anatolia, which of course we're going to be passing through. Areas that would include perhaps Pisidian Antioch, a different Antioch, and Iconium. Because these people were meant to read a letter called Galatians. The Galatians profile these people. First of all, they're a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. Once again, there's a percentage of Jews, probably a higher percentage, because the gospel starts with them and moves out all the time. And then you have, of course, the Greeks that are there, but you also have the Gauls. You have Celts that have come into the area 200 years before Christ. And if you were to see these people back in those days, many of them would have had red hair and turquoise eyes and extremely fair complexions, because it's where they came from. They came from France, they came from Britain, from Scotland, even from Ireland. And when we get to Pergamum, DeLake is going to show you a picture of one of the Gauls, and there's a story that goes with that too. I mean, this is a very, very intricate land. So much is going on here. The book of Galatians is written to these people, and in there, Paul describes something that is extremely important to all of us, and you know the story. It's in Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. Paul speaking to the Galatians, which again is a region, not a city. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. Of course he did. Remember, he went into Cornelius's house. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. Now, they've begun to establish churches in this area that heads off in this direction back into central Anatolia. The church is beginning to move west, and it's moving across Asia Minor first. As DeLake said one time, and let me just kind of interrupt this narrative with this, that if Jerusalem was the birthplace of the church, then Asia Minor, or Turkey, was most certainly its cradle. And it is so true. And now the church that was born in Jerusalem begins to move out, the very brand new born church. It's becoming a toddler now, and it's moving out in this particular direction. Well, now as the missionary journey has progressed and things have happened where Paul has begun to loop back into this area, they run into a snag. It's, as you know, because most of you are pastors here, there are people that are trying to say to Gentiles that if you want to become a Christian, you have to become a Jew first, a proselyte. So you have to be circumcised, you have to keep the Sabbath, you've got to stay kosher, you become a Jew, and then you can be part of the Christian sect. And this was the problem with the Galatians, and this is the problem that Paul had with Peter, because Peter swayed with that. In fact, he not only swayed with it, Barnabas did too. The confrontation that happened between Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Peter and Barnabas, when Paul confronts Peter to his face, too many P words here, when Paul confronts Peter to his face, was right in this area here. This is where it happened, and it provoked one of the biggest, most important milestones in church history. So Paul gets in Peter's face, but he says even he confronted them on their hypocrisy. Now, when we think hypocrites, we think of duplicitous people. You also know the word to mean mask wearer, but part of the picture that would come up in people's minds when you called someone a hypocrite was not just an actor on an ancient stage holding up a mask so that people could see their emotions, but they were considered clownish. So it's really a harsh thing to call a person a hypocrite, because you're not just saying, in our language, it would be just duplicity. but in theirs, they're calling you a clown. That's really, really a harsh criticism. So, verse 14, when I saw they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter, in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners know that a man is not justified by observing the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Jesus Christ, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by observing the law, because by observing the law no one will be justified. And then he goes on, and you know the rest of the story. What comes out of this to me is very, very surprising. What comes out of it is Acts chapter 15, which happens after this incident. Because shortly after this incident, the church is in an uproar because you have Pharisees who are messianic, but are insisting that Gentiles become Jews before they become messianic. And this is the problem. These are Pharisees. Pharisees were people who were protecting the Jewish world against Hellenization. What's that all about? Some of you know. Some of you may be scratching your head going, I wish I knew, or I think I know. This is what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about tomorrow, and it will blow open the New Testament for you if you don't know about these things. Meanwhile, we get back to this. The Pharisees are still legalistic. Paul is a Pharisee. He's in that category, but he's not legalistic anymore. He's bringing the Gentiles in without having to keep all the rules that the Jews are required to keep. Controversy erupts in the church. Peter is part of the controversy. Barnabas is part of the controversy. And so let's go up to Jerusalem. Remember, even though Jerusalem is south, you always go up to Jerusalem, and let's talk to the apostles. The apostles, as they're there, are going to have to make a decision. Headed by James. He's the head of the church now, and this is James, the brother of Jesus, not James, the son of Zebedee. That James is now dead. So James, the brother of Jesus, is brought this case. Guess who brings the case to James? You know, it's Peter. And Peter is now back siding with Paul. He's saying, telling the people, the Gentiles, that they have to become Jews first is wrong. It's an affront to the grace of God. It's a very bad thing. So suddenly Peter has accepted Paul's rebuke. And this is an exceptional thing. Peter is not vacillating so much as he is sorting all of this out, because he's not a scholar. He's not stupid, but he is no scholar. And suddenly he begins to learn the grace of God here when Paul gets in his face and says, you are deadly wrong. And he's rebuked, he's shamed and humiliated, and yet he could have stuck to his guns, because, as you know, Peter is very, very stern, and he's immovable, and he wants to be first. And suddenly he completely backs down, and he says, Paul's right. And when they go to Jerusalem and they stand in front of the council at Jerusalem and begin to hash out the issue, the person who comes to Paul's defense and sets the stage for Paul and Barnabas, who has now come to his senses on this, is Peter. And that blows my mind, and it moves me, because you think about this Peter who had to be rebuked so harshly right here. By the time they get to Jerusalem, he is Paul's greatest defender. That's the story that happens here in Antioch. Those are the big stories. And this becomes, of course, the headquarters of the missionary church now. The headquarters of the church is still in Jerusalem. But as far as all the missions going out, this is the mission center, because it truly is a crossroads of the Eastern world and the Western world as it's heading east, or the Eastern world as it's heading west. It will very likely come through here. There's all kinds of roads, Silk Roads, and the Royal Road, which we'll talk about when we get to Sardis, which is something that plays into the book of Esther in an amazing way, and we'll talk about that in Sardis along with a lot of other things. But here, this was being this gigantic Roman city. It was like Los Angeles, you might say. And frankly, there are a lot of missionary groups and ministers and what have you that are moving out to rural areas and places like Colorado and whatever. But all the mission work that's being successful are in the big cities, because these guys are the gatekeepers. Stay where the gatekeepers are, and I'll tell you that the gospel is going to go everywhere. And that's why they stayed in Antioch. They kept coming back here. Luke was from here. All kinds of other people were here. You can look down a list. Look it up on Wikipedia. You'll find it there. So anyway, I wanted to give you this orientation today, give you a lot to think about. Tomorrow we're going to pick some things apart that will bring all of this into sharper focus, and it will bring the rest of our trip into very, very sharp focus, and we'll keep arcing back to it. So there you go. Here we are, the real Antioch, the real thing, and maybe even the very first Christian church. Who knows? There we are. God bless you guys.